All right, so we're going to start looking at the second section of Chapter 10, so 10.2. And we're going to start to look at the specifics of the Presidency of the United States. We're going to look at the actual powers as outlined by the Constitution. We will also look at some of the more vaguely worded or loopholes, shall we say, in the definition of the president and their powers, the evolution of the presidency, the changing role or dynamic of the presidency. So, as I said previously, we had compared president and prime minister. We established what is the difference between those two and how those differences lead to some fundamental changes in the operation of the two offices. Unlike a prime minister, the president cannot be guaranteed a legislative majority. There are times where the president will be functioning against or at odds with large chunks of the legislature at the time that they are president. And that does mean that the president does not have the kind of sheer willpower, and that's a really bad way to define it. I guess a better way to put it is the assured control of the legislative branch. That's a much better way to say that. A president of the United States is not guaranteed to have Congress in their back pocket, so to speak. Now, that doesn't mean they're powerless, right? Basically, a prime minister's entire toolkit comes from the fact that they control Parliament. A president, just because he doesn't have complete control of both houses of Congress, doesn't mean that they are helpless. The Constitution provides at times some clearly defined powers and at times some vaguely defined powers for the presidency. Now, there has been debate since the very beginning if our founding fathers purposely left some of these vague powers, some of these loopholes there to give the president the opportunity to wield more power than others. If it was kind of an emergency situation sort of thing, who knows? We don't know exactly. We do have a handful of founding fathers' takes on it or writings, whether it be articles they wrote, Federalist Papers sort of entries. Some of them stayed fairly silent on the matter. We do know that the men who wrote the Constitution designed the president to be an office with limited power. We do know that our founding fathers were very fearful of what they considered an overpowering executive, King of England. They were very afraid of allowing that sort of system to be recreated here in America. And so they tried to create a president with limited power, but over time the presidency has evolved and has changed, even though the Constitution really hasn't changed on this topic. So let's start with, what does the Constitution actually say the president can do? The president's official powers are outlined in Article 2 of the Constitution. Remember, Article 1 is all about the legislative branch. Article 2 is all about the executive branch. Now, the president has two sorts of powers, those which the president wields exclusively and those which he wields in concert with Congress. First, let's look at what the president does by his lonesome. He serves as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Along with that, he is responsible for granting commissions to officers in the Armed Forces. The President can grant federal pardons and reprieves for federal crimes, with the exception of impeachment. The President may call Congress into special session. He's supposed to act as the official welcoming committee for all foreign ambassadors. He is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. We will get back to that one in a moment. He is to wield the, quote, executive power and to appoint officials to lesser offices. And some of you, being a little more astute, can already see some of these gray areas. What does that mean? Wield the executive power. Take care the laws be faithfully executed. Does that mean monitor? Does that take a more hands-on approach? You can see some of the wiggle room. What does the president, we'll go back to that picture in a moment, what does the president share with Congress? Well, with the Senate, the president and the Senate share, and this is where you get those differences between the House and the Senate. The House of Representatives has no say when it comes to treaties. It's an entirely Senate affair, and so the president basically has to confirm all treaties with the United States Senate, so that's a power that they both share. And something we might be a little more familiar with, the appointment of ambassadors, judges. We should all be very familiar with that Supreme Court judge process from the last couple years, other high officials. So the Senate has that confirmation process on all presidential nominees for these high offices, and they share the treaty. And then what he shares with all of Congress, approving and creating legislation for the United States of America. Now, if you want to be a real stickler, the president doesn't have a lot of authority and power. If you want to just look at this list alone, the things the president does without someone else's involvement, right? Because these require other people's involvement. If you just want to look at the things the president does by his lonesome, not a lot. I know some people are going, oh, commander-in-chief. Okay, first of all, for a large chunk of American history, not really that powerful. You have to remember, our country did not have a large standing army until, honestly, post-World War II. So for a large chunk of American history, you're the commander-in-chief of a very small military and a very small navy and army. You're not going to do a lot. All right, we weren't the global superpower we are today. You also have to realize that up until the more recent period of American history, the thought of using military force without the approval of Congress was sort of unheard of. So again, not exactly the awe-inspiring power that you might think of in the modern-day context. Regardless, take this list and take a very narrow interpretation or definition of these powers. The president is, according to your book, a clerk. The president does a lot of housekeeping matters for the United States. Your book noted 100 years after the Constitution, basically. In 1884, Woodrow Wilson, future president of the United States, wrote a book on American politics entitled Congressional Government. He pointed out that the business of the president is, quote, usually not much above routine, end quote, and mostly, quote, mere administration. He basically portrayed the president as just a different type of civil servant, like any other in the bureaucracy. I mean, different, but in general, just a civil servant with kind of a checklist of duties to be accomplished during their time in office. Now, I will say Woodrow Wilson, surprisingly or conveniently, depending on what he was doing when he wrote his book, he failed to note several glaring exceptions to that interpretation of the role of president. For example, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, gentlemen, not the greatest of examples on one hand, because taking the guy who was president in the most unique crisis situation in the history of the nation and using him as your glaring example of a president who goes far above and beyond the call, I think is kind of setting yourself up for failure in a way. It's kind of like the age-old, you shouldn't use Nazis for your argument, right? You can't justify something with, well, the Nazis, way to jump to the most extreme example humanly imaginable. Can you give me an example that is not Adolf Hitler? That's kind of the usual comeback that people would give. What I'm trying to say is, whenever someone uses Abraham Lincoln as their basic example for anything, I do kind of then say, give me another example. Because I don't think that you can use Abraham Lincoln, who has a lot of unique, distinct moments that no other president will have, hopefully, or has had. So, Woodrow Wilson, to the point that he wrote his book in 1884, he didn't have a whole lot of glaring examples of presidents who went outside the box beyond Abraham Lincoln. Now, the president's authority as commander-in-chief has obviously grown since the 1880s and since the founders originally wrote the Constitution, not only in wartime but in peacetime as well. The president has become far more important in directing or defining America's foreign policy, and defining economic objectives and the management of programs. I mean, a lot of things have changed and evolved. Going back to that original commander-in-chief, and this was the picture in your book that I said we get back to, this is the young man who is carrying the football. This is the briefcase that carries all of the information for nuclear war. It contains all of the scenarios, all of the launch codes, everything. It's called the football. If you ever hear someone talk about the nuclear football, they are referring to this briefcase. This guy, or whoever else shares this duty, there are several of them, obviously, so they can rotate. But the guy, there will be a number of men and women in the United States military. Their job will be to always be around the president. Relatively speaking, within arm's reach, so to speak. If the president goes on vacation, this person will go with the president. That doesn't mean they're actually going to be riding in the president's golf cart, but they will be accessible. They will be within a matter of minutes of the president, so that in case he needs to have access to our nuclear war plans that are available. Your book noted, if you pay close attention to the swearing-in ceremony of presidents, there is a person who will shift from one side to the other. When the president takes the oath of office and officially takes the office of president publicly, there will be this person in the background that will quietly shift from one president's side to the other president's side, symbolizing the transfer of military authority and power. It's this person. Again, not this specific person necessarily, but whoever is currently on the duty of carrying the football will casually, quietly shift from one guy to the other guy, signaling that this ultimate power has been transferred. Fun little fact. If we were in class right now, some of you would be asking a torrent of questions about this. We're not really into, discussing nuclear war and the Cold War and the single integrated operation plan, etc. But it is one of those things, like a lot of things I say, if it piques your interest, look it up. It is quite intriguing if you kind of just look at this whole concept and what is in there, or at least what we believe is in there, right? It's obviously highly classified. Anyhow, the president, this one, take care that the laws be faithfully executed. What does that mean? Does that mean that you just kind of double check, and if someone's breaking the law, you call foul and you let the courts deal with it or the Congress deal with it? Or does it mean, like Grover Cleveland, you use federal troops to break a massive railroad strike in the 1890s? Does that mean in 1957 you deploy the 101st Airborne to the campus of Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas to integrate a school based on a federal court order? Obviously, I'm giving you examples of presidents who took that to mean, yeah, I'm going to go above and beyond. I'm going to use my authority here to then force my authority here, right? But it's not clearly written out. I mean, it's vague, right? There's the opportunity to where, Grover Cleveland, Dwight Eisenhower said, well, I'm going to use federal military force to make sure the laws are enacted. Then there are other people like, I'm going to call Congress, I'm going to call a governor, I'm going to this, I'm going to that. They are loath or reluctant to deploy federal military force. Honestly, the greatest source of presidential power is not on this list. The greatest source of presidential power is not vested in the Constitution. Since the 1930s, what you have seen is presidential power coming from Congress, as your book noted. Starting with the New Deal, Congress has increasingly passed laws that grant the executive branch some sort of authority in overseeing programs, in managing programs, in directing administration, etc. We will actually talk more about this aspect in Chapter 11. This is where most of your growth in government, at least in federal bureaucracy, has occurred over the last few decades, actually. It's in these administrations and organizations and institutions which Congress sort of delegates over to the executive branch, and then the president fills them up and expands them. But anyhow, another issue or another thing that has occurred that, again, is not on this list beyond the growth of government delegation via Congress that has occurred to the executive branch is the American people have more and more turned to the president as a source of leadership, as sort of a central point that we look to for answers, for direction, for all these different aspects. I've mentioned in our class, whether it's the president's fault or not, the president takes the blame. He's the face that everyone associates things with government. Wrongly. I know I've said that. Too many Americans believe that the president does everything and is behind everything and controls everything. And I've said the president actually has far less power than the United States Congress, but the president takes the blame for it all. So that's another thing that the Founding Fathers did not necessarily expect. I will say that one thing about our Founding Fathers is they were very fearful of, again, too powerful of an executive. They were also concerned about an executive that was powerless, right? As your book noted, they equally feared monarchy and anarchy. There was great concern that if the president lacked the ability and the authority and the power to deal with Congress or kind of act independent of Congress, there basically would be no reason to have a president. On the other hand, you don't want an executive who can usurp the power of the legislative branch. Now, you have to remember, too, the states at this point, in 8 of the 13 states that signed on to the Constitution, in 8 of those states, the governor was chosen by the legislature. The governor wasn't even popularly elected. In 10 states, the governor was limited to 1 term. There were really only 3 states where the governor had any real independent authority, and that was New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. So if our Founding Fathers had simply copied the majority of the state constitutions, we would have a 1-term, very limited executive. Now, also, again, talking about our Founding Fathers when they were kind of cooking up this list, they were afraid that the president might use the power of the militia to disband state governments that were not cooperative. They were afraid that the president, that if the president basically had to get the approval of the Senate to make treaties, that the president would become a lackey or a tool of the United States Senate. And then, of course, there was the concern of re-election. There was concern that if the office of the presidency were the sort of thing that came through the legislative branch. And remember, there was a lot of belief that there was going to be once they cooked up that electoral college system, which we're going to talk more about in a moment. But there was a real strong belief that the electoral college would actually fail to produce a clear-cut winner a majority of the time. Meaning that a majority of the time, the House of Representatives would be in charge of selecting the president. There was a concern that if men understood that that was how the game was going to be played the majority of the time, you would have a lot of folks using a lot of corrupt methods to win over the votes of the House of Representatives to win the presidency. There would be a lot of promises, there'd be a lot of bribery, etc. And basically, we would have this incredibly corrupt, not truly democratic system. And you would have people who would get reelected time and time again by using this very corrupt method. Now, hindsight being 2020, many of these concerns seem silly. The president has never really used the power of the militia or the military to get their way. The House of Representatives only chose 2 presidential winners, 1800 and 1824. The United States Senate, yes, dominated the president on and off during the Gilded Age. Basically, the Gilded Age, a period when you really did not have strong, significant executive leadership. But since then, let's be real, the president acts independent of the influence of the Senate many times and in many ways. And the president has actually become very front and center on designing American foreign policy, for example, in shaping public opinion, of creating coalitions, of winning over people, of using what Teddy Roosevelt called the bully pulpit to win support to programs and legislation that they want to see done. And again, all these things were things that our Founding Fathers did not expect when they cooked all this up in 1787. The theory of, or the idea of a president, going on television, a medium that hadn't even been, conceived, and speaking to the American public at large, just totally not even talking to the Senate or the Congress first, but just giving a speech to the entire country at one time and throwing out all these ideas and not running them by anybody. The concept that we would actually have winners in the Electoral College, and it wasn't going to go to the Congress all the time. That's something that they never considered. The fact that we have popularly elected senators is something that our founding fathers did not consider. And it wasn't in their original system, right? And so we created an institution that was at its time unique and unprecedented. And they thought, yeah, this is going to work. And they did not accurately predict the evolution. We do know, again, though, our founding fathers were concerned about finding that delicate balance because, as Governor Morris of Pennsylvania said, make him too weak, the legislature will usurp his power. Make him too strong, and he will usurp the legislature. They understood we had to walk a fine line. And the first step in walking that fine line is how you pick a president. Okay? Popular election sounded like, as we said previously, not the worst of ideas, but it seemed very improbable that anyone would actually win a popular election in a country as large and diverse as the United States. Okay, and we're talking even in 1787. They looked at the United States and said it's far too large and it's far too diverse in population and voting groups, etc., for any one man to truly win a majority of the American people. So that would be a system that just would not produce a winner, at least not on the first go. And having multiple popular elections where you will down the voters is too difficult. Some people said, well, okay, we'll have the Congress elect the president. Well, that makes them basically a prime minister, doesn't it? I mean, that's, as your book said, quasi-parliamentary. That basically Congress would dominate the president. If it was established from the very beginning, the only way one becomes president is through the hallowed halls of Congress, well, you would have all the corruption and the bribery and the promises and the backroom deals. And presidents of the United States would be somewhat like those kings of Poland that you might remember learning about in World Civ, where because they were kind of at the mercy of being elected by the Polish parliament, kings of Poland were really just figureheads. They had no independent power because their entire position was dependent on making deals to get elected. And so after a bunch of discussion and debate, we came up with this interesting system that we call the Electoral College. One thing about it, it was to address the concern of the small states. Okay? If it was a straight popular vote, it would be a simple recipe. You go to the most populous states and you tell them what they want to hear. You cater to the largest states. You go to those few states, to those few large cities, to be honest, and you tell those voters exactly what they want to hear, and you win the presidency of the United States by winning, back then, by winning Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, a couple of other, Boston, and maybe a couple other larger urban, and I put that in quote, centers. You tell the people of Virginia what they want to hear, and you win the presidency. It doesn't matter that you lost 95% of the rural vote, right? You won those cities, you win. You won more votes. And, of course, the small states began to say, yeah, that's not going to fly. We will get railroaded by these candidates who just give in to the whims of the larger states. The plan was the Electoral College. Each state would send electors who then would cast votes for president and vice president. Now, the way members of the Electoral College are selected varied by state. Not that important. What's important is understanding that when they cooked this up, they were expecting this to end up going to the House of Representatives. They fully expected that in most states, the people of the state and then the Electoral College voters of that state would end up casting their votes for favorite sons, either, boys from that state or from that region. That basically every election we would have 3 or 4 people and they would win chunks of the country, but they would not be able to translate that support to other chunks of the country. And so you would not have a clear-cut winner, and that way it would end up going to the House of Representatives because there would be no clear-cut majority. Now, this seemed like a good plan. Now, I know some of you are going to go, wait, you just said that they fully expected it to fail to produce a winner. Yeah, that doesn't mean that it's a failed plan, because think of all the concerns that they were facing. They were concerned about small states being underrepresented or totally ignored. The Electoral College prevents that. Rhode Island has 3 Electoral College votes. Little Rhode Island, right? It doesn't matter that Wyoming only has 500,000 people in it. Wyoming still is a prize in the presidential election. It's 3 electoral votes, which is not the greatest of prizes, but then you start to think about it. A person goes and campaigns and wins over, Wyoming and Montana and Idaho and, the Dakotas. And that balances out the Electoral College vote of a state like, Ohio. Now, do the populations of those states that I named match the population of Ohio? No, they don't. They're actually less. But it means that you couldn't just go to the handful of big states and win the election, because if somebody were to gobble up all those small states, even with their pathetically tiny populations, they kind of balance out. So it allows the small states to be heard. It does still allow the large states to have a say, and to have a larger say, but not an overwhelming say. It's much like what we did with the bicameral legislature with the House and the Senate, right? Where we make it where, yes, we recognize you're bigger and therefore you get more representatives, but we got the Senate to kind of balance it out and make everybody play more equally. The Electoral College does that. It balances out the size and sheer weight of the large states without totally discounting the small states. Think about it too. If the election were not to be clearly won in the Electoral College, it goes to the House, where there are more small states than there are big states. And so you add up the number of congressmen from small states, and they actually outnumber the number of congressmen from the large states. And so again, the small states would end up having the ability to kind of influence or even choose the winner per se. And for those of you who are like, are you sure about that? When you go to vote in the House, you vote as a state, not as a delegate, not as individual congressmen. So even if the large states had more congressmen than the small states, as long as the number of small states outnumber the number of big states, it's like the U.S. Senate. Everyone's equal. Virginia gets 1 vote for president when it goes to the House. Rhode Island gets 1 vote for president when it goes to the House, right? So we basically copied our legislative branch when we designed the Electoral College, right? There's that first level where it's more populist, and if that level fails, it goes to the everybody's equal regardless of size level. Now, the plan, like I said, met all these tests. One thing our founding fathers did not foresee was the rise of political parties and their ability to unite vast voting blocks across large geographical and demographical areas, and therefore able to produce actual winners in popular elections. Our founding fathers did not foresee this, okay? They did not expect the Electoral College to actually be won on a regular basis. But we'll have to get back to that in a moment. Now, let's look at the evolution of the power of the presidency. Okay, and it goes in kind of chunks, right? There are eras to the presidency. The first presidents, the first 5 or so of them, all founding fathers. Some of them founding fathers who served in the war, like George Washington. Others, statesmen who served in the signing of the Declaration, or they'd served in the Continental Congress and the Confederation, and they wrote the Constitution, etc. Of the first 5 presidents, 4 served 2 terms. John Adams was a one-hit wonder. Washington and Monroe weren't even opposed. George Washington ran unopposed, and James Monroe basically ran unopposed as well. Wait, James, hang on. I apologize. I had to take time out to get my founding fathers straight, because I was like, it's John. No, wait, that's John Adams. There's too many Johns and James, basically. We need some new names in the presidency. But back to what I was saying. George Washington ran unopposed, And Mr. Monroe basically ran unopposed. You might remember that the Federalist Party basically died during that wave of nationalist sentiment that came out of our quote-unquote victory in the War of 1812, really our victory in the Battle of New Orleans. And the Federalist Party all but died a very quick death, and that left the Republican candidate, Mr. Monroe, basically unopposed. Also, during these early presidents, you had some of the greatest statesmen in American history serving in cabinet-level positions. Alexander Hamilton was Washington's Secretary of Treasury, and as we all know, was a big fan of the urban commercial class. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson was an agrarian, a man who supported basically agrarianism and more states' rights. So you had not only some of the greatest minds in American history, you started out with competing factions or competing interests. Now, President Washington strongly spoke out against political parties, and political parties almost immediately emerged. Matter of fact, let's be honest, the first political parties emerged during Washington's presidency, and it was because of the infighting between Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Madison and Jefferson, but we'll give Jefferson more credit than Mr. Madison. But regardless, the two competing views for the future of America, basically, led to the first political parties, the Federalists, led by Mr. Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, who eventually just become known as Republicans. No real relationship to the modern-day Republicans, exactly. And these two, now they were originally called factions, and they eventually emerged into what we today would just call political parties. Everybody at the time, of course, thought factions were horrible. Washington spoke out against them in his final address, his farewell address. You know, everybody bemoaned them. Everybody attached a stigma to them. This is ridiculous, let's be honest. Democracy needs political parties. You have to have a way to organize large groups of folks to vote, to unite groups who all have common interests. It makes sense for people to form these sort of groups, these clubs, these factions, which will morph into political parties. I like the line your book used, parties are as natural to democracy as churches are to religion. Right? It makes sense that like-minded citizens are going to form organizations to help convince other like-minded citizens to vote their way, right? So that kind of takes us through the first 5 or so presidents, right? And then you're going to have that number 6 guy, John Quincy Adams, who wins a contested election. The last time the House of Representatives actually chose a winner in 1824. And that's going to be followed up by the 1828 comeback or rematch victory of Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson came to office during a time of change, not only for the presidency, and that change in the presidency came primarily thanks to Mr. Jackson, but it also came during a time of change for the United States in general, okay? Now, you have to understand, first of all, Andrew Jackson, even though he had some political experience, he'd been a congressman from Tennessee, he'd been in the House and in the Senate. His stints there, not nearly as long as some other folks. He was elected based on his military record, right? He was a war hero. He was the hero of the battle in New Orleans, right? They'd written songs about this man. He'd also been a bit of an Indian fighter, but he got elected basically on his war record. On just his sheer, what do I want to say, persona, charisma, right? It wasn't on his political record. He didn't run on, oh, look at all the things I passed. He ran on, remember that time I saved New Orleans for a British invasion? You're welcome. And so he got elected as a military hero. And actually, being 61 years old at the time of his election, some people kind of thought he was a little over the hill, right? He was kind of on the downswing. Yeah, they were a bit wrong. First of all, Jackson, not coming from a strictly political background, but from a more rough and tumble upbringing and just kind of professional experience with the military and actually fighting, Andrew Jackson was not about to sit back and watch Congress run the show. And again, He is early in American history when the real relationship between president and Congress is still kind of fluid. It's up for grabs. It hasn't been firmly defined yet. And so Andrew Jackson famously vetoed 12 acts of Congress, more than all presidents before him combined. He vetoed more legislation than the first 6 presidents combined. And he actually vetoed more laws than any president until Andrew Johnson post-Civil War. So he held the record for the number of vetoes for over 30 years. Now, I do want to point out none of his vetoes were ever overturned or overridden. Every one of his vetoes stood. So that goes to show you something. Andrew Jackson, his vetoes too, they weren't based on some question of the Constitution. Andrew Jackson rarely, if ever, argued things based on the Constitution. He argued them based on his just beliefs. His vetoes were based in, I don't like this policy. I don't agree with this policy. I don't think this should be the law. He didn't say, I don't think that the Constitution grants us this sort of legislative leeway. He saw himself as the tribune of the people. He was there to represent the people of the United States in their wants and needs. Those who have had my American history class might remember we have an essay about this in American history about Andrew Jackson's view of the presidency and how that's typified in certain events in his presidency, like the Indian Removal Act. The Supreme Court said you can't move the Cherokee, and Andrew Jackson was like, yeah, I'm going to move the Cherokee because that's what the people want. I don't care what John Marshall wants. I care that the American people want this done. The Bank of the United States. A lot of Americans had a poor view of the Bank of the United States, and even though the Supreme Court had said the bank is completely legal, Andrew Jackson was like, yeah, I don't like the bank, I'm going to kill it. Andrew Jackson did feel he was the only man truly elected by the American people, right? He's the only man whose office requires a vote of the entire American population, not just a state or a district. So he took the stance of, I represent America, right? And I am the one guy in government standing up for the average American. Everybody else represents a certain block of America. I represent the whole country. Interestingly, he became president at a time of dramatic expansion of the country. By the time he was president, 24 states were in the United States, basically almost double the original number, and of course all of them Western and new Southern states, voters who liked frontiersman Andrew Jackson. Also, it's a time of growing voting rights. Your book doesn't really talk about this, but this was the period when the right to vote became more expansive or more available because property qualifications dropped. The number of people who voted in the 1824 presidential election is a little over 355,000. 4 years later, in the 1828 election, over 1 million people voted for president. And no, the American population didn't triple in 4 years. It's because voting rights dropped dramatically. Voting rights expanded. Voting qualifications dropped dramatically. And so Andrew Jackson truly feel like he had a mandate from the people. Over 1 million people had voted when he ran. He got more votes for president in 1828 than people voted in 1824. So he really took to heart the idea of, I represent the American people. Andrew Jackson also showed you, what the power of popularity could do, what public opinion could do. He wasn't afraid to take on Congress. And, it's also the time period he lived in. He was president during the heyday of Henry Clay, of John C. Calhoun, of Dan Webster. The great triumvirate of American legislative history. He was president during some of the great debates, the nullification crisis, the Missouri Compromise. Well, actually, the Missouri Compromise was right before his presidency, but he was president when we were desperately grappling with how do we resolve the sectional and slavery conflicts that were threatening to rip this country apart. So it's in this environment of tension and argument that this rough and tumble frontiersman comes to the office of presidency and decides to play the game that way. Now, President Jackson was opposed to a large and powerful federal government. In many ways, he was a Jeffersonian in his view that, a simple agrarian policy was the best for America. But he did believe that a strong, independent presidential office was the best thing for the average American. And his view is not going to be adopted initially. It's going to take a while before we get strong, independent presidents. With the end of Jackson's second term, Congress is going to quickly get back in control, and we're going to have our first of a series of forgettable presidents, or no-name presidents, as some people like to call them. After Andrew Jackson, Congress is going to be back in control, and really there are only 3 presidents in the next, 100 years that really stand out. We'll slim that down. The next 70 years. James K. Polk, Grover Cleveland, and Abraham Lincoln. Those are really the only presidents who really stand out during that next 70 years. The presidency basically became subordinate to the Congress. Of the 8 presidents who followed Andrew Jackson, as your book noted, 2 of them died in office, Mr. William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor. None served more than 1 term. This is the period when most students struggle to name presidents. If you're curious, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, who only served 1 term, William Henry Harrison, who died after 1 month. He was then replaced by Zach Tyler, who, it's funny how he even got to be there. He lost his re-election bid to Mr. James K. Polk, who did everything he wanted to do in 4 years and dropped the mic and walked away. Mr. Polk was replaced by Zach Taylor, who died in office. Taylor was replaced by Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore was followed by Franklin Pierce, and Pierce was followed by the worst president ever, Mr. James Buchanan. None of which really are memorable for anything. Some of you are hearing those names for only the second time in your life. Right? They didn't do anything. Congress did it all. It wasn't until Abraham Lincoln, James K. Polk did something. I apologize. I should not be lumping him in with the rest. And again, he was a 1-term guy because he felt like he'd done everything he wanted, right? He fought Mexico, manifested our destiny, good to go. All the rest of them didn't do anything, really, to speak of. They basically sat back and watched Congress fight out the brewing Civil War controversy. Now, the only real guy to break any new ground was President Lincoln, who I said is an exception to the rule, and I hesitate to point him out, but you have to. He was the only guy to really do anything. He was elected as a minority president. He only won 40% of the vote. There were 4 men running for president that year, though, so let's cut him a little bit of slack. He represented an almost brand new political party, the Republican Party, which was kind of the result of the death of the Whig Party, uniting with all these other anti-slavery groups and free soil groups. He had been a man who had opposed James K. Polk's policy of war against Mexico. He actually had been a man who was critical of how Andrew Jackson had handled the presidency. So here we've got a man who actually had been critical of previous powerful presidents, now becoming president at a time when you needed a powerful president. And he made use of that vague, the vague phrasing of the Constitution, take care the laws be faithfully executed. Abraham Lincoln, your book said, raised an army, spent money, blockaded southern ports, temporarily suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and issued the Emancipation Proclamation, all without the Congress's prior approval. That's not to say Congress didn't eventually approve some of his measures. They did. But a lot of things, he just went with it, and he expected Congress to fall in line. Now, he, of course, justified everything with, we're in the midst of an emergency called a civil war, give me some breathing room. And in some ways, he did copy previous presidents. Your book mentions, and a lot of people aren't aware, Thomas Jefferson fought a kind of unofficial war against the Barbary pirates of North Africa during his time as president. It's actually why in the Marine Corps hymn, there's a line about to the shores of Tripoli. We sent the United States Marines to go fight the pirates in Libya during Thomas Jefferson's time as president without an actual declaration of war. So Abraham Lincoln wasn't exactly breaking new ground, but he was reasserting a powerful independent presidency. But enough about Mr. Abraham Lincoln and all of the rules that he bent and broke necessarily, or all the loopholes he jumped through. After Abraham Lincoln, hey, Congress gets back into power for a while. You've got that Gilded Age and Reconstruction, and Congress basically made the rules. It had become very clear that during national emergency, presidents had a large, wide, expansive playbook that they could run with, and that a powerful, popular president who wasn't afraid of some conflict could get stuff done. And yes, Teddy Roosevelt might be the first guy. Grover Cleveland was also in that mix. Grover Cleveland wasn't afraid to take on Congress. But up until Grover Cleveland, or up until Teddy Roosevelt, the only guy between Teddy and Lincoln that is really memorable was Grover Cleveland for his stance to kind of fight Congress. Teddy Roosevelt and after him a little bit Woodrow Wilson started to give us glimpses of the modern president, but truly it wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt that we're going to see this concept of the modern president that we know and either love or hate today. I mentioned Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, a strong personality. I'd also like to point out Grover Cleveland was the only Democrat in a long line of Republican presidents before and immediately after the Civil War, which might also explain why he wasn't willing to back down. But Grover Cleveland, he vetoed 414 bills, more than any president up until Franklin Roosevelt. Although most of his vetoes were to stop pensions for Civil War veterans. But again, his vetoes were against things he didn't like. It wasn't that, when I say that he was a strong president, he didn't have his own agenda. He just wanted to stop things coming out of Congress he didn't agree with. He didn't have his own plan. The first guy to really show up with a plan was Woodrow Wilson. Other presidents were largely ignored, Rutherford B. Hayes, Chester Arthur, Calvin Coolidge. Nobody really paid attention to anything they had to say. Woodrow Wilson was the first guy. In 1913, he showed up with an actual legislative agenda. He had a plan. Everybody else just kind of ran audibles, if anything, right? It wasn't until the 1930s with FDR's New Deal that you saw anybody really show up with anything resembling an overarching, game plan that they were hell-bent to drive through the United States Congress. Our concept of the president as kind of this central figure in the government, calling shots, making moves, instituting programs, that all started in the 1930s with FDR's New Deal. And I want to point out, as I wrap up here, there's a reason why it has stayed this way for 80 years now, coming up on 90 years now. And the reason for that is simple. FDR changed the role of government forever, possibly. There is now more government in our lives. There's more bureaucracy. There's more institutions. There's more administrations. There's more rules and oversight and all these things. And a lot of them flow out of the executive branch. So what FDR did is he created the framework that basically every president since FDR has had to operate in, which means every president since him basically has to play the game the way FDR did, where they are a mover and a shaker and a central figure and decision maker. You can't take a back seat like you used to back in the day. There's just simply too much going on in the government. And so we will continue looking at this in 10.3, where we look at how the president uses the office of the presidency to sort of do that moving and shaking and get what they want, because, spoiler alert, the president doesn't get to vote in Congress. The most the president can do is veto something out of Congress, right? The president can't even get a bill started in Congress. He's got to get the cooperation of Congress. So how does the president mess with Congress when he's not even allowed to be in the room, so to speak? But again, that will be our next lecture.